Hello, you're listening to Storytelling Saga, the podcast that shares stories. I'm your host, Allie, and this week I'm discussing Waiting for Godot, a two-act tragicomedy by Samuel Beckett. I first read this play my junior year of college, and it's extremely unconventional in the sense that you can boil it down to the fact that nothing of significance happened in this play. And since nothing of significance happens, it can be interpreted so many different ways. And I remember we had to write a paper about the play focusing on a specific interpretation, whether that was philosophical, political, religious, existential. I myself wrote about the existential themes since those are the most prominent throughout and what I found the most interesting. But having reread it, I will say that more of the religious themes stood out to me since there are so many biblical references throughout the play. But it can simply be summed up as two men waiting for a man named Godot who never shows up. And those two men are Estragon and Vladimir. And there's just one setting, a country road, a tree. That's it. And at the start of the play, Estragon is trying to take off his boot when Vladimir enters, and Estragon says, "Nothing to be done." And what's interesting about Vladimir and Estragon is that they have no defining physical characteristics. We never learn about their appearances throughout the play, for them or for any of the characters for that matter. But in distinguishing Vladimir and Estragon, one interpretation to sum them up, personality-wise, is that Estragon always focuses on the physical, whereas Vladimir focuses on the mind. For instance, with Estragon trying to take off that boot, and then he's talking about how he thinks he may have been beat up, but he can't really remember. And there are moments where a couple of times, he falls asleep, and he's just worried about his aches and pains, whereas Vladimir is much more restless throughout the play, and it's symbolic with the hat. They both wear bowler hats. That's only one defining thing. But when he takes off his hat, peers inside it, there's a moment where the stage directions say, "He looks on the crown as though to dislodge a foreign body, peers into it again, puts it on again," and he says the same thing as Estragon, "Nothing to be done." So he always has that restlessness, and he has these metaphysical musings, whereas Estragon is just worried about his boots, worried about being hungry at one point, and then Vladimir just gives him a carrot, and first he's saying, "Oh, this is a turnip," and then he gives him a carrot afterwards. And it's primarily just a dialogue between the two of them, but a few other characters show up, two of whom are Pozzo and Lucky. And Pozzo is this abusive man towards his slave, Lucky, and he treats him like an animal, to the point where when we meet the two of them, Lucky enters, he has a rope around his neck. So it's as if he's like a mule. And then Pozzo enters holding the rope. So he pulls at it, he's just controlling him, and Lucky is mostly mute. He has almost no dialogue, except for a lengthy monologue at one point when Pozzo says how, he will dance for you, he will think for you, so it's a means of entertainment. So then when they have him dance, and then he just goes on and on with this monologue that first starts out as this speech about theology in a sense, but then it just turns into nonsense and nothingness. As we see throughout this play, how they really are just talking about nothing, Estragon and Vladimir, and that there's this familiarity with them. At times they embrace, at times they act like they're old friends. At times, though, Estragon seems confused by why they're waiting, and many times, which is another key thing with this play, a lot of repetition with the dialogue, in particular with this exchange. "Let's go. We can't. Why not? We're waiting for Godot. Ah." And then the other character that they encounter is a boy who tells them by the end of Act 1 that Godot will not be meeting them this evening, but that he will surely be there tomorrow. So then both acts of this play ends the exact same way. "Well, shall we go?" "Yes, let's go." They do not move. And at first, it's Estragon asking, shall we go? And Vladimir replies, yes, let's go. But then by the end of the play, in Act 2, those roles have switched, in which Vladimir is asking, well, shall we go? And Estragon replies, yes, let's go. They do not move. So that goes back to how they are interchangeable in many ways. And they talk about, at one point, Estragon saying that they should just hang themselves because they're just waiting and waiting, but that Godot is, in a sense, going to be this salvation, that, once he comes, we will have that relief. So even with the name Godot, which evidently Samuel Beckett said that this wasn't intentional, that Godot, it sounds like God. So it's as if they're waiting for God. It's as if they're just kind of in purgatory, waiting and waiting for this man, this relief, this salvation that never comes. And it's unclear their relationship with Godot. They don't even know what he looks like, since at first they question if Pozzo is Godot. And also going back to Estragon, how he's just focused on his hunger, when Pozzo at one point is just feasting on chicken. And then afterwards, when there's just bones sitting there, and then he asks him if he can have the bones. And Pozzo said, you have to ask Lucky, since he's the one who has to carry it. And then he lets him eat the bones, so he's just eating the bones. He's just desperate for food, Estragon. And then also how with Vladimir, focusing on the mind with his hat, there's a whole part in the play where there's no dialogue, and it's this kind of vaudevillian act, in a sense, where they are just swapping hats back and forth, Estragon and Vladimir, after Lucky and Pozzo have left. And this is the stage directions for it. It's just kind of a merry-go-round of one hat after the next after the next. Estragon takes Vladimir's hat. Vladimir adjusts Lucky's hat on his head. Estragon puts on Vladimir's hat in place of his own, which he hands to Vladimir. Vladimir takes Estragon's hat. Estragon adjusts Vladimir's hat on his head. Vladimir puts on Estragon's hat in place of Lucky's hat, which he hands to Estragon. Estragon takes Lucky's hat. Vladimir adjusts Estragon's hat on his head. Estragon puts on Lucky's hat in place of Vladimir's hat, which he hands to Vladimir. So that goes on and on. So it's just this sign of meaningless, how things are just going around and around until Vladimir eventually stops it, when Vladimir takes it and throws it down then finally with one of the hats. So just going back to that theme of existentialism, all this pointlessness, all of this waiting around for, as it turns out the end, waiting around for nothing. And as they keep saying, nothing to be done, nothing at all, no point at all. At one point, Vladimir says, let us not waste our time in idle discourse. What are we doing here? That is the question. And we are blessed in this, that we happen to know the answer. Yes, in this immense confusion, one thing alone is clear. We are waiting for Godot to come. And then by Act 2, Estragon doesn't have to ask, what are we waiting for? He knows that they're waiting for Godot. But with that ending, that exchange of, shall we go? Yes, let's go. And that they don't move. They're saying to themselves, well, we should go. Let's go. And then they just decide not to. They just stand there. They're still waiting for something that's never going to come. It's that sense of hopelessness, in a way. They want to go, but they just don't for some reason. They're not choosing to leave. They're choosing to stay. Instead of taking the initiative themselves to leave, they're just standing around waiting for something or someone to, in a sense, rescue them, waiting for that relief of Godot. There's one point, too, when Estragon's saying we should hang ourselves, but then they say, oh, well, Godot will be that relief, that we should do this unless Godot shows up. And then in Act 2, Pozzo, the dynamic with Pozzo and Lucky has changed, and that Pozzo is now blind. Lucky doesn't say a word now at all. And Pozzo at one point says, have you not done tormenting me with your accursed time? It's abominable. When? One day is not enough for you. One day he went dumb. One day I went blind. One day you will go deaf. One day we were born. One day we shall die. The same day, the same second. Is that not enough for you? They give birth astride of a grave. The light gleams an instant. Then it's all night once more. He jerks the rope. Oh, and then they leave again. So then the rope then is shorter now, and it's as if, since Pozzo is blind, that Lucky is guiding him, whereas before Pozzo was really the one in control. So then that has completely changed. And then Vladimir, expanding on that later on, says, "Tomorrow when I wake, or think I do, what shall I say of today? That with Estragon my friend at this place until the fall of night I waited for Godot, that put so past with his carrier, and that he spoke to us? Probably. But in all that, what truth will there be?" And the stage directions say, Estragon, having struggled with his boots in vain, is dozing off again. Vladimir looks at him. "He'll know nothing. He'll tell me about the blows he received, and I'll give him a carrot. Astride of a grave and a difficult birth. I can't go on. What have I said?" And a lot of the religious references, there's references to how when, for instance, Estragon is barefoot, and he's saying, "Oh, you can't be barefoot," and then Estragon says, "Christ was barefoot." There's a reference to Cain and Abel with that story of how Cain killed his brother Abel. And again, Godot, God. And this play has been parodied a lot. It was parodied in the season 14 finale of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. It's with Dennis and Charlie, and then the three other characters that show up, Dee, Mac, and Frank. That's really clever. It's also actually parodied, well, not parodied, but those lines of, "Yeah, we should go," and then they don't move. It's in a couple times in 2 different episodes of New Girl, in the episode Injured and in the series finale. But with these characters, with their bizarre, interesting dynamic, with Estragon and Vladimir, also how they call each other Gogo and Didi, that there is this brotherhood in a sense, that it's also been interpreted as this old married couple type dynamic, which is interesting. But overall, how we control our own destiny, and yet these two will just keep waiting, yet knowing that Godot is never going to come, because then when the boy shows up again, and Vladimir is saying, "Oh, are you a different boy?" So it's not clear if that's the same boy or perhaps the boy's brother, but saying the same thing, that Godot will not be coming tonight, but maybe tomorrow, and that apparently they had said that the night before, etc. So they just keep waiting, and that more time has passed. At first that tree is bare, and then the second act there's some leaves on the tree. It's a great play. It's really interesting because, again, nothing happens. There's really nothing significant at all. But just in these conversations, how you can just connect it to our own existence, if you're focusing on a religious way, if you're focusing on it in a philosophical way. Shall we go? Yes, let's go. And will you move or will you not? It's up to you. So, great play. You can find it online and read it for yourself. You can definitely read it in one sitting. It's that quick of a read. So it's just interesting to revisit this since I haven't read it since college, so it's been a number of years. So perhaps the point is just to determine your own fate. So yes, let's go. And with that is going to conclude this week's episode of Storytelling Saga. You can follow the podcast on Facebook and Instagram at Storytelling Saga, as well as on Twitter at Storytell Saga. You can also send me any questions, comments, or writing prompts by leaving me a message in the contact section of storytellingsaga.com or by sending me an email at storytellingsaga@gmail.com. Next week, we are just 2 people. Not that much separates us. Not nearly as much as I thought. I'll be discussing The Help. Until then, thank you for listening, and remember, write what you love.